She was just a poor servant working in the king's palace, struggling every day under cruelty and humiliation. But when she made a small mistake, the merciless king gave her the most terrifying punishment. He threw her into a cage full of starving hyenas. Everyone thought it was her end, but what happened next left the entire palace in shock. Watch till the end to see the unbelievable twist, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. The sun rose slowly above the palace walls, casting a golden glow across the sprawling courtyards of Oba Kazim's kingdom. The palace itself was a masterpiece, built with gleaming marble floors, tall carved gates, and open halls where pillars stretched upward like ancient trees. Every morning, the courtiers rushed to begin their duties. The cooks prepared heavy meals for the nobles, the guards trained in the yards, and the servants, those silent shadows of the palace, swept, scrubbed, and bent their backs in service. Among them was a young woman named Amara, a servant of no wealth, no family, and no voice. She had been sold into palace labor when she was only a girl, and for years she lived under the weight of obedience, surviving on scraps, obeying orders without question, and hiding her pain behind quiet endurance. To the powerful king, she was nothing more than dust beneath his sandals, and yet her eyes carried resilience that even hardship could not erase. But Oba Kazim was not a ruler of kindness. He was feared far and wide, a man whose voice alone could send trembling through his council, and whose punishments became the whispered warnings told in every marketplace of the land. Cruelty was his weapon, and fear was his throne. For years he had thrown disobedient guards into dungeons, executed rebels in the town square, and humiliated servants until their spirits broke. The kingdom appeared strong on the outside, but beneath the surface, the people lived under chains of terror. It was this climate of cruelty in which Amara's life unfolded, and though she kept her head bowed, fate was about to pull her into the storm. It began with something so small, so ordinary, that no one could have guessed the doom it would bring. One evening, during a grand royal feast, Amara was tasked with carrying a golden tray of roasted goat and spiced yams to the king's table. The hall was alive with the sounds of music, drums pounding in rhythm, nobles laughing over their cups of palm wine, and dancers twirling in colorful fabrics. The air was thick with the smell of pepper, smoke, and roasted meats. Amara walked carefully through the crowded hall, her bare feet silent against the polished floor, the heavy tray balanced in her hands. She kept her eyes lowered, never daring to meet the gaze of King. But in her nervousness, her foot slipped slightly on a smear of spilled wine, and before she could steady herself, the tray tilted. The golden goblet on the edge rattled, tipped, and spilled its dark red contents right across the royal table. The wine splashed directly onto the king's robe. The music stopped. The dancers froze. Every noble, every servant, every guard in the room turned their eyes toward the king, waiting for his response. Oba Kazim's face darkened, his jaw clenched, and slowly he rose to his feet, his robe dripping with red wine that looked almost like blood. His eyes fixed on Amara, and in that silence, she felt her heart collapse. She dropped to her knees, trembling, her forehead pressed against the floor, begging for forgiveness in a voice that shook like leaves in the wind. But the king's pride had been wounded in front of his entire court, and for a man like Kazim, such humiliation was unforgivable. "Bring her to me," he roared, his voice echoing through the great hall. 2 guards rushed forward, seizing Amara by her arms and dragging her to the center of the room. The nobles whispered among themselves, their faces pale, for they knew the king's anger was deadly. He looked down at her with eyes like fire, and in that moment, Amara knew she was staring into the face of death itself. "You dare spill wine upon my robe," the king spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Before my nobles, before my council, you shame me with your clumsy hands." Amara wept, pleading, "Mercy, my king. It was a mistake, please, I beg you." Her voice broke. Her chains rattled as the guards tightened their grip. But mercy was not a word known in Oba Kazim's heart. He raised his hand and declared, "She shall be fed to the hyenas." A ripple of horror swept across the hall. The hyenas. Everyone in the palace had heard their cries at night, the wild, haunting laughter that rose from the dark cages at the edge of the courtyard. Starved and vicious, the beasts were kept by the king as living instruments of punishment. Many had seen the bloody remains of those thrown to them before, though few spoke of it aloud. To be cast into their cage was not just death. It was terror itself, a punishment designed to strip a person of dignity and life in one merciless act. The guards dragged Amara away as the nobles turned their faces, unwilling to watch her suffering. Yet some could not hide their fascination, for cruelty had long become the king's spectacle. Amara's cries echoed through the halls as she was pulled down the corridors, past the gates, and out into the courtyard where the iron cages stood. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in hues of orange and crimson, and as the guards pushed her forward, the eerie laughter of the hyenas rose in the distance, chilling her to her bones. Inside their cages, the beasts stirred, their glowing eyes catching the last light of the day. Their spotted coats shone, their powerful jaws opened wide in hungry anticipation. Amara collapsed onto her knees, shaking, as the guards wrapped heavy iron chains around her wrists and ankles, ensuring she could not fight or flee. She could barely breathe, her chest tight with fear, her lips trembling with whispered prayers. She thought of her life, her childhood cut short, her years of servitude, her silent endurance. Was this how it would end? Torn apart by beasts, her body left in pieces to feed the ground? From the palace steps, Oba Kazim emerged, his face still twisted with fury. He stood tall, his robes replaced, his crown gleaming in the fading light. The entire court gathered to watch, some with morbid excitement, others with dread. The king raised his hand, and the guards pulled Amara to the edge of the cage. The hyenas pressed against the iron bars, their laughter sharp and inhuman, their teeth flashing white. "Throw her in," the king commanded. The guards hesitated only for a second. Then with brutal force, they shoved Amara forward. She stumbled, fell through the open gate, and landed hard on the dusty floor inside the cage. The door clanged shut behind her, the lock snapping in place. The hyenas circled, their paws scratching the ground, their eyes burning with hunger. Amara screamed. The palace courtyard rang with her cry as the beasts drew closer, their growls mixing with that terrible, mocking laughter. The king watched from above, his lips curling into a cruel smile. The first chapter of Amara's punishment had begun, and the entire kingdom held its breath to see whether she would die like so many before her, or whether fate had something else in store. The moment the iron gate clanged shut behind her, Amara felt the breath leave her body. The sound echoed like a death knell, final and absolute, cutting her off from any hope of escape. She was alone now, a fragile human figure in chains, trembling inside a pit where survival had never been granted to anyone before. The hyenas circled her slowly, their paws pressing against the dust, tails swaying low, shoulders twitching with every careful step. Their eyes glowed with a strange fire, an unnatural hunger sharpened by days of deliberate starvation, for the king ensured that the beasts never knew comfort or satisfaction. Hunger was their weapon, their loyalty, their reason to exist. The laughter-like cries began again, chilling, cruel, echoing to the courtyard as nobles leaned forward, eager to witness the horror that always followed. Some covered their mouths, unable to look, while others whispered that this servant would not last more than a breath once the beast lunged. Amara's knees scraped against the earth as she stumbled backward, chains dragging in the dust, clinking like the sound of funeral bells. Her body shook violently, her heart racing, her breath shallow and fast. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to flee, yet her legs were bound and her arms were shackled. She could do nothing but crawl backward, her palms pressing desperately into the dirt as if she could dig herself into the ground to escape. She screamed for mercy, for help, for God to intervene, but her voice was drowned in the jeering laughter of the hyenas and the low murmur of the crowd above. The largest hyena drew closest, its powerful body gliding across the pit floor like a shadow. Its jaw opened, saliva dripping from teeth sharp enough to crush bone. Its nose twitched as it caught the center of fear, the raw sweat pouring from her trembling skin. It lunged forward and Amara shrieked, falling onto her back, her chains rattling against the ground as she kicked wildly, her bare feet striking nothing but air. The crowd gasped, a ripple of horror sweeping across the nobles. Even the guards stiffened as they watched the beast hover inches from her face, its hot breath washing over her, its jaws snapping shut just beside her ear. But instead of biting, the hyena stopped suddenly, its head jerking upward, its ears twitching to some unheard sound. The other hyenas had halted too. They sniffed the air, circling tighter around her, yet none leapt forward to tear her apart. Instead, they snarled, not at Amara, but at the walls of the pit, as though something greater than hunger had stirred them. Amara froze, too afraid to move, her wide eyes darting from one beast to another. She could not understand what was happening, why she was not yet dead. The king frowned from above, irritation flashing across his face. He had seen the hyenas kill countless prisoners without hesitation, ripping flesh from bone in a frenzy. Why now did they stall? The courtyard grew restless, whispers rising among the nobles. Why do they wait? One muttered. Perhaps the girl is cursed, another replied. Perhaps the gods have marked her. The murmurs grew louder, until even the guards exchanged uneasy glances. Oba Kazim's fury deepened. He would not allow his authority to be questioned, not in front of his court. His voice thundered across the courtyard, sharp and commanding. Kill her, he roared, pointing down into the pit. Tear her apart. Feed my beasts. The hyenas growled at the sound of his voice, their bodies tense, but still they did not strike Amara. Instead, one by one, their heads turned, not to the servant cowering in chains, but upward toward the king himself. Their eyes gleamed with something darker than hunger. The air shifted, heavy and suffocating, as though the very earth held its breath. Amara, still on the ground, followed their gaze, her eyes widening as she realized the beast's focus had changed. They were no longer circling her. They were watching him. Then, with a terrifying chorus of snarls and shrieks, the hyenas lunged, not at her, but the walls of the pit. Their claws scraped against the stone as they leapt higher and higher, jaws snapping at the edge. Dust and rock crumbled under their weight. The crowd screamed, stumbling backward as the beasts clawed their way upward. Guards rushed forward, spears raised, but the hyenas were relentless, their strength multiplied by rage and hunger. One broke free first, leaping over the wall in a blur of spotted fur and teeth. It landed on the ground outside the pit, its laughter echoing as nobles fled in every direction. Another followed, then another, until the courtyard was chaos. Screams, the clash of weapons, the thundering of paws against stone. Amara watched in stunned silence, her body frozen as the impossible unfolded before her eyes. She should have been their victim, but instead, the beasts had turned their fury elsewhere. And then it happened, the moment that would change the fate of the palace forever. The largest hyena, its eyes burning with a strange intelligence, fixed itself upon Oba Kazim. The king, though startled, stood his ground, his pride refusing to allow fear. He raised his staff, shouting for the guards to defend him. But before his command could even leave his lips, the beast charged. With terrifying speed, it lunged upward, knocking the staff from his hands, its massive jaws snapping just inches from his face. The king stumbled backward, rage and disbelief etched across his features. He had always been the master, always the predator. Never had he been prey. The courtyard erupted in screams as more hyenas swarmed toward the dais where the king stood. Guards fought desperately, their spears plunging into fur, but the beast seemed unstoppable, driven by some force beyond mere hunger. Blood sprayed across the marble steps, the air filled with the scent of death and dust. The nobles ran, trampling each other in their haste to escape. Through the chaos, Amara sat chained in the pit, her body shaking, her mind reeling as she watched the impossible truth unfold. The king's cruelty had turned against him. The largest hyena leapt once more, and this time it struck true. It crashed into Oba Kazim with the full weight of its body, sending him sprawling onto the ground. He screamed, a sound unlike anything his court had ever heard from him before. Raw, human fear. His crown rolled across the stones as the beast's jaws closed around his arm, tearing flesh and bone with a sickening crunch. The once proud king thrashed beneath the weight of his own punishment, his own chosen weapon now devouring him. The people who had feared him for years stood frozen in shock, witnessing their ruler brought low by the very beasts he had used to terrify them. Blood pooled across the steps. The king's screams grew weaker, drowned beneath the snarls and laughter of the hyenas. The nobles no longer looked upon him as a ruler, but as a broken man stripped of his power, his cruelty repaid in kind. Some whispered that it was justice from the gods, that no man could rule with such brutality without facing his reckoning. Others simply ran, unwilling to be caught in the storm of vengeance that had been unleashed. And through it all, Amara remained in the pit, her chains heavy but her spirit unbroken. She stared upward, tears streaming down her face, as she realized that fate had spared her life. Not by mercy of the king, not by her own strength, but by the sudden and terrifying turn of destiny. The hyenas had refused to kill her, as though they sensed her innocence, and instead had turned their wrath upon the tyrant who had commanded their hunger. For the first time in years, she saw him not as a god, not as an untouchable master, but as a man, fragile and mortal, undone by his own cruelty. The courtyard was chaos, blood and screams filling the air. But in that chaos, a seed of hope stirred in Amara's heart. For if the king could fall, then perhaps the chains upon her people might one day be broken as well. The courtyard was still ringing with chaos, the shrill cries of fleeing nobles mixing with the bone-cracking growls of the hyenas that swarmed over the once-feared king. Guards, once loyal and disciplined, broke formation as panic took hold of them, their spears slipping from trembling hands as they watched the unimaginable, the tyrant they had served blindly, screaming like a cornered animal, dragged into the dust by the very monsters he had raised to enforce terror. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she knelt at the bottom of the pit, her chains biting into her wrists, her breath uneven and ragged. She should have felt relief, triumph even, to see her tormentor undone, but what she felt instead was something far more complex, an overwhelming tide of disbelief, fear, and something that tasted like hope, though she dared not name it aloud. The people had always believed Oba Kazim was untouchable, invincible, chosen by gods to reign with cruelty. Yet here he was, not a god, not a mortal, but a man ripped apart by teeth and claws, his crown lying discarded in the dirt. The spectacle had shattered the illusion of his power in a way no rebellion ever could. Those who remained standing in the courtyard did not rush to aid him, nor did they look for ways to save his life. Instead, they stared wide-eyed, whispering among themselves, their words rising in fragments above the chaos. The gods had turned against him. He is cursed. The servant girl was spared. Rumors spread with the speed of wildfire, each voice adding fuel to a story that would shape the kingdom forever. Amara, though shackled and terrified, had suddenly become the center of their eyes. To them, she was no longer just a servant who had been condemned. She was the one the beasts had chosen not to harm. She was a girl who had survived when survival was impossible. And in that survival, the fear that once bound the people to the king began to break apart, piece by piece. The hyenas tore into the body of their former master until the once proud Oba Kazim was unrecognizable, his command silenced forever beneath the tearing of flesh. Then, as if some unseen signal had been given, the beasts turned their attention away from the corpse and toward the trembling crowd. Panic erupted anew as nobles and guards scrambled for safety. Some leapt from the marble steps, fleeing through palace corridors. Others climbed walls, trampling over one another in their desperation to escape. The courtyard, once the stage for the king's cruelty, had become a slaughterhouse of his own making. Amara pressed herself against the wall of the pit, her chains clinking as she tried to make herself small, invisible, praying the hyenas would not turn their hunger upon her now that their master was gone. Yet even in her fear, she noticed something extraordinary. The beasts did not leap back into the pit. They did not circle her again, nor did their yellow eyes burn with the same hunger they had shown the king. Instead, they prowled across the courtyard, scattering the tyrant's followers, their snarls sending waves of terror through those who had once cheered for blood. It was as though Amara had ceased to exist in their world, as though they recognized her not as prey, but as something else entirely, something untouchable. And above all the chaos, one sound rose higher than the rest. The wails of the commoners who had been dragged to the palace to witness yet another execution. These were the people who had lived their lives under Oba Kazim's iron rule, who had lost loved ones to his pitiless punishments, who had bent their backs under the weight of his endless demands. For them, this moment was not just the end of man, but the end of a nightmare. They began to shout, first in disbelief, then in exhilaration, then in chants that rolled like thunder across the palace walls. The king is dead. Justice has come. The servant lives. Their voices wove together into a roar that no soldier could silence, no noble could suppress. Inside the pit, Amara lifted her tear-streaked face toward the sound, her chest tightening as she realized what it meant. She had been nothing, a shadow in the halls of the palace, invisible except when the king chose to unleash his wrath upon her. Yet now, the same people who once pitted her saw her as something greater. She did not want it, did not ask for it, but fate had thrust it upon her. The role of a symbol, a survivor who stood where none had ever stood before. But the fall of a tyrant did not mean the end of danger. The palace was still in chaos, guards fighting desperately to reclaim control, nobles scrambling to flee with their wealth, hyenas prowling unchecked through the courtyard. In the middle of it all, Amara remained trapped, her chains holding her prisoner, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. If she did not escape soon, she would either die in the crossfire or be forgotten amid the collapse of the kingdom. Her eyes darted frantically, searching for a way out, when suddenly a hand appeared above the pit. It was one of the palace guards, not one of the cruel ones who had jeered when she was thrown into the cage, but a younger man whose face she faintly recognized. His eyes were wild with fear, yet his voice was urgent, carrying a desperate clarity. "Take my hand. Now!" he shouted, glancing nervously at the beast prowling nearby. Amara hesitated, her mind spinning with suspicion. Was this a trick? Was he merely using her as bait to distract the hyenas? But she had no time to think, no luxury to doubt. Her survival depended on action, and so, with a trembling breath, she stretched her chained hands upward. The guard grunted as he pulled her with all his strength, the weight of her shackles making the climb nearly impossible. Her knees scraped against stone, her wrists bled with a metal bit into her skin, but she did not stop. With one final heave, she collapsed onto the courtyard floor, gasping for air, her body weak and trembling. She had escaped the pit, but the danger was far from over. The hyenas were circling closer now, their eyes scanning the crowd, their bodies tense with restless energy. The guard glanced at her chains, his jaw tightening. "We have to move, or they'll tear us both apart," he whispered urgently, tugging at her arm. "Come, before it's too late." But Amara's eyes lingered on the ruined figure of Obakazim, lying broken and lifeless in the dust. For years, he had been her tormentor, the nightmare that haunted every waking moment. And now he was nothing more than a carcass in the dirt. She should have felt free. She should have felt relief. And yet, what she felt most of all was disbelief, that such a man so untouchable had fallen in such a way. The chants of the people grew louder, echoing against the palace walls, shaking the very ground. "The servant lives, the servant lives." It was not just a cry of victory. It was a cry of rebellion, a cry that declared the end of fear. Nobles who had once bowed to the king now looked around nervously, realizing their power had crumbled with his. The people were no longer afraid, and once fear breaks, it can never be rebuilt. Amara stumbled to her feet, her chains clinking as she swayed. The guard at her side urged her forward, his face set with determination, but she knew deep inside that this was not over. The hyenas had chosen to spare her. The people had chosen to lift her name, and fate had chosen to bind her to a story she could never escape. She was no longer just Amara, the servant. She was a girl who survived the pit, the symbol of a kingdom's turning tide. And symbols once born cannot be hidden away. The palace was no longer a place of power. It was a battlefield of screams, blood, and broken chains. The tyrant was dead, but what rose in his place was still uncertain. Amara, weak and scarred, stood at the center of it all, unknowingly carrying the weight of a future that would test her in ways even the pit never could. The chant still rang across the courtyard, rising like thunder that shook the marble columns of the once proud palace. "The servant lives, the servant lives." The words were not just echoes of relief or awe. They were a declaration, a signal to the world that the reign of terror had finally collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. Amara stood at the center of it all, her chains heavy around her wrists, her knees scraped raw from the climb out of the pit, her body trembling with exhaustion. She should have felt victorious. She should have collapsed into the ground in gratitude that she had been spared when no one else ever had. Yet, As the roar of the people grew louder and the smell of blood mixed with dust and smoke in the air, she felt only the crushing weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. She had survived, but survival was no longer just hers to carry. It belonged to everyone who now looked at her as a sign that the world could change. The young guard who had pulled her from the pit tugged at her arm, his face pale with both urgency and fear. "We cannot stay here, not with him still loose," he whispered. His eyes darted to the hyenas that prowled across the courtyard like demons unchained. Their yellow eyes glowed in the fading sunlight, their muzzles smeared with blood, their eerie laughter slicing through the chaos. They were no longer bound to the king's command, and their hunger was unrestrained. Already, they had lunged at guards who had dared to raise spears, tearing through them with feral joy. The nobles shrieked as they scrambled into hidden passages, their silken robes catching on sharp stones, their gold trinkets clattering across the floor as they abandoned treasures in favor of their own lives. Amara staggered forward, her chains dragging against the marble as she tried to keep pace with the guard. The weight of the metal was unbearable, each step sending shocks of pain through her swollen wrists, but she forced herself onward. Every eye in the courtyard followed her, some with awe, some with disbelief, and some with quiet hatred. For in every crowd, there are always those who cling to the past, those who cannot bear to see their power crumble. Amara could feel their stares like daggers, though none dared approach her now. Not while the hyenas prowled between her and the world. Not while the chants of the people drowned out every order the nobles tried to give. Yet even as she stumbled through the carnage, her mind could not escape the vision of Oba Kazim's fall. For years, she had feared him as though he were more than a man, as though his cruelty were eternal and untouchable. To see him brought down, his royal robe shredded, his crown lost in the dirt, was to see the truth unveiled, that he had always been mortal, fragile, bound by the same flesh as those he crushed. And if the king could fall, what did that mean for the kingdom he had built on fear? Could it stand, or would it collapse with him? The guard led her through a broken archway, its once polished stones cracked from years of neglect. Beyond it lay a corridor that smelled of dust and decay, a place where servants once moved unseen by the nobles above. Here, away from the courtyard's eyes, the roar of the people was muted, though still present, pulsing like a heartbeat through the walls. Amara leaned against the stone, her breath ragged, her body trembling from exhaustion. The guard knelt beside her, his voice low and urgent. "They will look to you now. Don't you see? The people believe the hyenas spared you because the gods themselves willed it. You cannot just disappear, not now." Amara shook her head weakly, her chains rattling as tears welled in her eyes. "I am no leader," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was only a servant. I cleaned floors. I carried trays. I have no voice, no power. They will turn on me as quickly as they turned on him." She gestured with trembling hands toward the courtyard beyond. "The hyenas spared me, yes, but it was chance, nothing more. I cannot carry what they want me to carry." The guard's gaze hardened, though not with anger, rather, with the determination of someone who saw a truth she could not yet accept. "You lived," he said simply. "That is enough. In a world that is drowned in cruelty, survival itself is power. Do not waste it." But before Amara could reply, the sound of boots striking stone echoed through the corridor. Torches flickered as a group of nobles appeared, their silken robes torn, their jewel crowns askew, yet their eyes still sharp with malice. They were not the timid nobles who fled at the sight of blood. These were the ones who clung to power with iron claws, who would not let the death of a tyrant strip them of their rule. Their leader, a tall man with silver threaded through his beard and cruelty etched into every line of his face, stepped forward, his voice dripping with venom. "So this is the girl who survives the pit," he sneered, his words curling like smoke. "You think the gods favor you? You think the people will follow a servant? No, they will be reminded of their place. And so will you." Amara froze as the nobles advanced, their guards raising spears, their eyes burning with the desperation of those who feel power slipping away. The young soldier at her side tensed, his hand tightening around the hilt of his blade, though he was hopelessly outnumbered. The corridor was narrow, the shadows deep, and Amara knew that if they were seized here, she would not live to see another sunrise. But then, From beyond the archway came a sound that silenced even the cruelest sneers, the low, chilling laughter of the hyenas. The noble's eyes darted nervously, their steps faltering as the beasts appeared. Shadows against the flickering torchlight, their bodies sleek and powerful, their teeth glinting with fresh blood. One by one, they slinked into the corridor, their eerie cries echoing like a chorus of ghosts. And at that moment, Amara saw it, the noble's fear, the same fear that ruled her own life, now reflected in their trembling hands and pale faces. The hyenas did not lunge, not yet. They circled, their bodies brushing against Amara without harm, their yellow eyes fixed instead on the nobles who had come to claim her. It was as though the beasts themselves had chosen sides, and their choice was clear. The tall noble's sneer faltered, his voice cracking as he barked orders to his guards. Kill them. Kill them now. But no soldier moved. No one dared lift a spear against the creatures that had slaughtered a king. The palace, once united in its cruelty, was crumbling into fragments, its power devoured not by enemies from beyond its walls, but by the terror it had unleashed upon itself. Amara, chained and trembling, realized the truth in that moment. Survival was no longer just hers. It had become a foundation of something greater. The people's chants, the noble's fear, the beast's choice, all of it had shifted the balance of power. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just a servant. She was a symbol, whether she wanted it or not. And symbols, once born, can ignite revolutions. The corridor was suffocating with silence, broken only by the clicking of claws against stone and the uneasy breaths of men who once believed themselves untouchable. Amara stood at the center of it all, still chained, still trembling, yet no longer the powerless servant who had been dragged to the pit hours ago. The hyenas brushed past her legs without harm, their laughter echoing against the walls like a judgment pronounced from beyond the grave. Their eyes, glowing like embers, were fixed not on her but on the nobles who had cornered her in their desperate bid to reclaim control. For the first time in their lives, those nobles, men who had dined on the suffering of others, who had ordered deaths as casually as one orders wine, looked like prey. Their jeweled rings shook on trembling fingers, their once proud crowns now heavy burdens pressing them toward the ground. Amara's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as she watched the tall noble, the one with the silver threaded through his beard, try to mask his terror. "We will not bow to animals," he spat, his voice cracking though he tried to hold it firm. His guards shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the beasts and their master. The command to strike hung in the air like a curse, but none dared act. For what sword could be quicker than the jaws of creatures born from shadows, dripping with the blood of the king? The first scream shattered the stalemate. One of the lesser nobles tried to flee, his silken robes catching on a jagged stone as he stumbled. The hyenas lunged with terrifying precision, dragging him down in a blur of fur and teeth. His shriek echoed to the narrow corridor, raw and desperate, but ended abruptly, swallowed by the sound of tearing flesh. Blood slicked the stone beneath them, its iron scent filling the air, and the nobles who remained froze in horror. The beasts lifted their heads, their laughter ringing louder now, a symphony of mockery that no crown could silence. Amara closed her eyes, not out of fear, but because the sight burned into her soul. For years, she had been forced to witness suffering, to clean blood from marble floors, to stand in silence as others were torn apart in spectacles of cruelty. But this was different. This was justice turned inside out, the predators devouring those who had once commanded others' deaths. When she opened her eyes again, she no longer saw just the horror of it. She saw the shift of fate itself. The nobles were not gods. They were not unbreakable. They were nothing more than men, and the world had begun to strip them bare. The tall noble, shaking now, backed against the wall, his voice breaking as he tried to summon control. "Stop this. You will regret defying us. The kingdom will fall into ruin without us." But his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The young soldier at Amara's side stepped forward, his blade drawn, his voice carrying conviction of someone who had nothing left to lose. "The kingdom was already in ruin because of you," he said, his tone steady, each syllable like a hammer against stone. "What falls tonight is not our home. It is your tyranny." The nobles faltered, The guards who had once been their shield lowered their weapons, their loyalty crumbling as they watched their masters brought low. One by one, the spears clattered to ground, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of surrender. Amara felt her knees weaken, not from fear this time, but from the weight of realization. This was it. This was the moment the world turned. The hyenas, as if understanding the shift, slinked back into the shadows, their work done. They did not need to kill them all. The terror they had left in their wake was enough. The nobles stumbled back, stripped of authority, their crowns feeling like shackles rather than symbols of power. And as they fled into the darkness, the soldier turned to Amara, his eyes searching hers. "It's time," he whispered. Amara wanted to shake her head, to deny the burden that pressed down on her shoulders. She was still bound in chains, still covered in dirt and blood, still just a girl who had never asked for this. Yet when she stepped out from the shadows of the corridor and into the courtyard, once more, the roar of the people swallowed her doubts. The crowd surged toward her, their faces alight with a mixture of awe and desperation, their chants rising louder than before. "The servant lives. The servant rises." Her chains caught the last light of the dying sun, gleaming like twisted symbols of everything she had endured. The soldier lifted his blade high, and with a sharp strike, shattered the manacles from her wrists. The iron clattered to ground, and in that sound, the people heard the breaking of an era. They surged forward, kneeling not in servitude, but in recognition of something far greater. Hope. Amara stood above them, her body trembling, her heart pounding, her voice caught in her throat. She had no speech prepared, no grand words to deliver. And yet, when she finally found her voice, it was not weak. It carried across the courtyard, steady and raw. "I am no queen," she declared, her words slicing through the air like lightning. "I was a servant, as all of you have been servants. Servants to fear, to cruelty, to a tyrant who believed himself a god. But tonight, we are no longer servants. Tonight we rise." The eruption of cheers was deafening. The walls of the palace, which had once echoed only with screams of pain, now trembled with the sound of freedom. People climbed the steps, tearing down the banners of the old king, flinging his insignia into the fire. The flames climbed higher, casting long shadows across the courtyard, shadows that seemed less threatening now and more like the heralds of change. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. The kingdom was broken, scarred, and fragile. There would be struggles, betrayals, and battles yet to come. But for the first time in her life, she did not feel powerless. She did not feel invisible. She felt the heartbeat of a people who had chosen survival, who had chosen her survival as their beacon. And in that moment, Amara understood what true strength was. Not the brute force of a tyrant's fist, not the cruel laughter of nobles drunk on blood. True strength was endurance. True strength was rising from chains and blood and dirt, standing tall even when the world tried to grind you down. True strength was hope. The fire roared higher, illuminating her face, casting her not as a servant, but as a figure reborn. The chants grew louder still, echoing into the night. The tyrant was dead, the nobles were broken, and the people, at last, were free. And so, under the watchful eyes of beasts that had once been used to terrify, and beneath the sky that bore witness to centuries of cruelty, a new dawn was born. A dawn written not in crowns and thrones, but in survival, courage, and the voice of one who had risen from the pit. Sparkles, and so, the servant who was meant to die walked free, while the cruel king met his own fate. Justice had finally spoken. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales.